Welcome to exercise 7, organ systems. This is our last lab exercise. If you are taking 1409, we'll pick up with exercise 8, cardiovascular system, and go on to the respiratory system and then the digestive system and a bunch of other organ systems. So this would be a nice practice and study and learn some of the basic organs and organ systems. If you don't have to take biology 1409, well, you probably ought to know these basic things on organ systems anyway, so yeah, we're going to make you learn it. Exercise 7 does start on page 65 with a bunch of instructional objectives. Normally I don't go through the instructional objectives point by point, but this time it works better. So we'll be keeping an eye on the instructional objectives. You might have to flip to different pages to see what we're talking about. The first instructional objective says to describe anatomical position. We don't actually have any test questions on anatomical positions, so read all about it on your own, and don't study it too much. Number 2, know the definitions and differentiate between organs and organ systems. Now, way back, like the first day in chapter 1 of lecture, I do go through some of the organization on the human body. It does start with the chemical level. You put a bunch of chemicals together, like 2 hydrogens and an oxygen, and that makes water. Once you put a bunch of those chemicals together, you do get a cell. Cells and organelles, yeah, we've talked about those. When you get a bunch of cells working together, you do have a tissue. Tissues, when they start working together, organs would be tissues working together, and then an organ system would be organs working together. Now, we're not going back to the various tissue types, but there are 4 different tissue types. There's epithelial tissue that covers things, there's muscle tissue that moves things, there's nervous tissue that sends nerve impulses, and then there's connective tissue like bone and blood that connects the body together. Organs would be generally 3 or 4 of these tissues working together. So if you're talking about a stomach, it is some muscle tissue where you've got some mixing and churning of food. You've got some nerve impulses that tell your brain you're hungry or full, or that the muscles are actually contracting. There is some epithelial tissue that lines the inside and the outside of the stomach, and then there's some connective tissue. Well, there's at least blood going to the stomach. There aren't any bones in it, but there are 4 different tissue types working together to make the stomach be an organ. Now, many people are familiar with things like stomachs, livers, and intestines, but even some of the other stuff out there that you might not have thought of as an organ. Everything we talk about in this chapter is going to be some sort of organ, including an individual muscle. It is some muscle tissue. There's some nerve impulses that tell you to move that muscle tissue. There's epithelial tissue that surrounds the nerve fibers and the muscle fibers, and then there's a blood supply going to it, so there's actually all 4 tissue types working in, say, the biceps muscle, which does make the biceps muscle an organ. Most non-science majors don't think about it that way, but yeah, everything we talk about today will be some sort of organ. Now, once you put all these organs together, you do start talking about an organ system. So when you get the stomach, the liver, the intestines all working together, you do talk about the digestive system. When you talk about the lungs and the trachea and some other parts that shall remain nameless until biology 1409, working together, that would be the respiratory system. When you put the biceps, the triceps, the quadriceps, and the hamstrings working together, that would be the muscular system. Organ systems would just be organs working together. The third instructional objective says to identify the following body cavities on a human torso model, dissected cat or rat. Yeah, we'll be looking at a human torso model. You should also be able to list organs that occupy some of the cavities, i.e. write the stuff down. There might not be enough room on page 65, but page 64 is a big blank piece of paper. You could write stuff down there. The first body cavity is the dorsal body cavity. The dorsal cavity refers to the backbone side, like the dorsal fin on a shark is on the back side. Yep, that would be the backbone side. Now, many of our cavities can be divided into other cavities on the same side. On the back side of the body, you would also have the cranial cavity, which contains the brain, and the spinal cavity, which contains the spinal cord, not the spine. The spine is actually the bones. It's the spinal cord that's contained within the spinal cavity. No, I'm sorry, I've taught anatomy one too many times. Like I said, the cranial cavity does contain the brain. Well, on this picture, we've removed the brain so that you can see more of the cavity. Miss Crotty does like to use the little baby torso models in the lab. Kind of hard to see from the picture here, but they're about a 1.5 to 2 feet high, so I do call them baby models, and they do show a lot of different organs. The model does actually have a brain that goes with it, but we've removed that brain so that you can see the cavity, which would contain the brain. The spinal cavity is the hole in one of the vertebrae where the spinal cord would actually be running through. This is one of the thoracic vertebrae. It kind of looks like it's got little holes. He's got some problems with osteoporosis. Some of our anatomy students do look at some real bones in the lab, and if you see any kind of damage and holes in the bones, yeah, that's often a real bone. Ew! Yeah, we don't touch them in lab, it's okay. If the dorsal body cavity was on the backbone side, the ventral cavity is going to be on the tummy side. Yes, it does include the abdominal pelvic cavity, which would be its more formal name, but really the ventral cavity would be anything on the front side of a human or belly side of an animal. It can be broken down into multiple parts and pieces. The ventral cavity does consist of the thoracic and the abdominal pelvic cavity. The thoracic cavity itself is the chest cavity, and it can also be broken down into two cavities, the pleural cavity, which contains the lungs, and the pericardial cavity, which contains the heart. The abdominal pelvic cavity is going to be pretty much anything below the diaphragm. It can be divided into the abdominal cavity that contains the intestines, stomach, liver, and other assorted organs. Yes, I know, some of the intestines are actually in the pelvic cavity. That's nice, deal with it. Most of the intestines would be in the abdominal cavity. The pelvic cavity is going to be kind of below the layer of the hips. It is going to contain the bladder and some reproductive organs. Yes, I know some of boy parts are actually outside the pelvic cavity. And some of girl parts may even be in the abdominal cavity, but for the most part, we're going to say that the reproductive organs are, for the most part, in the pelvic cavity. We did say the thoracic cavity was the chest cavity. It's kind of anything above the layer of the diaphragm. It does include mostly the heart and the lungs. There's a lot of other anatomy structures in there, but the only things we actually expect you to know are the heart and the lungs, so we'll talk more about those. The pleural cavity does contain the lungs. Pulmonary is probably the more common code word for lungs, but pleural is certainly the second runner-up there. Anytime you see pleural, that's probably going to refer to lungs, and the pleural cavity does contain the lungs. The pericardial cavity contained the heart. Peri is around, and cardia is heart. So if you can read through the Latin, it actually says it's the cavity around the heart. It does contain the heart. We did say the abdominal pelvic cavity was below the diaphragm. The top purple dashed line is pretty much the level of the diaphragm. So stuff below that would be the abdominal pelvic cavity. Now, the abdominal pelvic cavity can be divided into the abdominal cavity below the diaphragm but above the hips. Between the top line and the middle line would be the abdominal abdominal cavity. It does contain most of the intestines, stomach, and liver. Sadly, all of those have been removed from this model. You can see the kidneys and the adrenal gland and a spleen. The pelvic cavity would be between the layer of the hips and, well, the end of the abdominal pelvic cavity. Between lines number 2 and 3 would be the pelvic cavity. It does contain the bladder. You can vaguely make out the little tan bladder in there with the number 8. And the there aren't any reproductive organs on this model. You can see part of the large intestine there. Don't look at it. Most of the intestines would be in the abdominal cavity, but yes, there are a few pieces of them in the pelvic cavity. Don't look at them. You'll need to flip over to Figure 7.1, Body Cavities, on page 68. What they'd like you to do is place the correct letter of the indicated body cavity in the space. Match the letters with the cavity. This'll do more good if you think about it yourself, so I'm going to pause for a few seconds. You might want to stop the video for a few seconds and answer the questions. Hopefully, you figured out that letter A is pointing to, it kind of looks like the brain and the spinal cord. Oh, that would have to be the dorsal body cavity. B is pointing to the brain, would be the cranial cavity. It's a little hard to tell exactly where C is pointing to, although it is pointing to the spinal cord, so that would be the spinal cavity. E is pointing to, well, probably the thoracic cavity. They're not going to get specific enough to talk about the pleural versus the pericardial cavity. G is pointing to the abdominal cavity. H is pointing to the pelvic cavity. G plus H would be the abdominal pelvic cavity. E plus F would be D and the ventral body cavity. Okay, I did them out of order. G, F, B, A, H, C, E, D. Hopefully you got them on your own, though. Back on page 65 on the instructional objectives number 4, for any structure or organ covered in this lab exercise, know its function and to which organ system it belongs to. Most of this is actually found on chart 7.1. You do need to know the organ systems and their functions. The integumentary system covers the surface of the body, protects against infection, keeps some stuff in the body, keeps some stuff out of the body. The digestive system breaks down food into chemicals that can be absorbed into the bloodstream. The circulatory system is going to be the heart pumping blood all throughout the body. The respiratory system, you breathe in the oxygen, you breathe out the carbon dioxide, works a lot with the circulatory system to deliver that oxygen to the bloodstream. The urinary system forms urine, just like its name says. Yeah, that's the removal of waste products from the blood. The skeletal system, or your skeleton, would protect some of the organs, but it does a lot of providing levers for movement, does some producing of blood cells, and of course you can store calcium there. The muscular system is going to do muscle movements of all things. The reproductive system will produce offspring, boy parts and girl parts. The nervous system does communication, instant communication from the brain, spinal cord, down some of the nerves, and back. The endocrine system you might not be quite as familiar with. It does relay messages between organs via hormones. Anytime you talk about a hormone, it's going to go all throughout the body and usually do something. Growth hormone makes you grow taller. Follicle stimulating hormone stimulates follicles to grow. Luteinizing hormone? Not as easy to talk about, never mind, but it's going to do something for the body. The immune or lymphatic system does provide protection and defense against foreign invaders, ideally including the stupid coronavirus thing. Oh, Sorry, hopefully we'll all get some immunity going and we won't have this problem again. The instructional objectives did say that for any organ covered in the exercise, here's a list of organs that you will need to know, be able to identify, and know what organ system they're in. We'll be talking about them shortly, so I'm just going to list them off here. The stomach, the liver, the small intestine, the large intestine, pancreas, heart, lung, diaphragm, adrenal glands, kidney, bladder, brain, skin. You're probably not through writing. You should probably stop the video for a few seconds and continue to write the organs down. The liver is a large brown organ on the right-hand side of the patient. Hey, it looks like it's the left side of the picture. Yeah, but in anatomy class, I know we're not in anatomy class, but in anatomy class they refer to the side of the patient, not the picture. So still, that large brown thing on the right side of the patient, left side of the page, is going to be the liver. The liver is going to do a lot of detoxifying chemicals and produces some bile. It is part of the digestive system. The stomach would be the organ on the left side of the body. That's, you put food in mouth, you chew your food, you swallow the food, it goes down to the stomach. Stomach's going to do some mixing and churning and start some of the digestion. Both some of the mechanical digestion and some of the chemical digestion. There's also the large and the small intestine. The large intestine is the gray thing around the outside of the abdominal pelvic cavity. The large intestine is part of the digestive system. Its main job is to absorb water from the gross stuff coming out the back end. The small intestine does have a smaller diameter and takes up more of the inside or the middle of the abdominal pelvic cavity. The small intestine's job is to absorb most of the food, any of the proteins, lipids, nucleic acids, or sugars that your body needs to use. We will eat the food, you digest it down, and the small intestine's job is to absorb those nutrients. Once all of those nutrients are absorbed into the bloodstream, water moves from us by method of osmosis from the large intestine into the bloodstream. There was a reason we tortured you with osmosis after all. The pancreas is kind of a special organ. For one thing, he's a little hard to find. You do have to remove the liver and the stomach from the model to actually see the kind of yellowy pancreas that would be behind the stomach. The pancreas is part of the digestive system and part of the endocrine system. He's actually going to fall into both categories. The pancreas does secrete some digestive enzymes that help digest food down, but it also secretes insulin and glucagon. Insulin's the one that helps you store glucose. If you eat sugar cookies for breakfast and drink cherry Cokes, don't do that, that's not good for you. But if you do eat sugar cookies and drink cherry Coke for breakfast, you'll have high blood glucose levels and your pancreas will secrete some insulin to try to store that glucose and bring those levels back down for you. Insulin is going to be one of those hormones in the endocrine system. Ironically, the pancreas also secretes glucagon, another hormone. If you're dieting and didn't eat sugar cookies for breakfast, you might not have high blood glucose levels. You might need to take some of that glucose out of storage. And glucagon can actually take the fat out of storage so that you can use it. If you're dieting, you want some high glucagon levels. I don't think you'll find an ethical doctor who will just prescribe glucagon for you. You probably shouldn't just overdose on that. That's probably a bad plan, but it sure would be nice. Sounds like a much simpler way to diet there. The lungs are the pink organs in the thoracic and pleural cavities. The lungs are going to be part of the respiratory system. You would breathe in oxygen, breathe out carbon dioxide. There really are two lungs, one on the right side, one on the left side of the patient and the page. I've removed the patient's left lung here. Don't remove a patient's left lung, but it has been removed in this picture so that you can see the heart, which is kind of underneath both of the lungs. The diaphragm is a big major breathing muscle in the respiratory system, it's actually how you breathe. The diaphragm, when it contracts, rides down. There's more space in the thoracic cavity, so air comes in the lungs. When the diaphragm relaxes, it rides up and there's not as much space in the thoracic cavity, and so air goes out and you exhale. It's also a nice dividing line between the thoracic cavity and the abdominal pelvic cavity, but in real life, what it does is it breathes for you. When it contracts, you breathe in. When it relaxes, you breathe out. Both the lung and the diaphragm are part of the respiratory system. The heart over there is going to be part of the cardiovascular system. You can also see some of the red and blue blood vessels with the left lung being removed there. Blood vessels would also be in the cardiovascular system. Hopefully you already knew that the heart pumps blood around the body. Yeah, we'll get into more detail in 1409 if you have to take it. Sometimes it's a little hard to see the diaphragm on that last picture. Here I've removed the lungs and you're seeing kind of the bottom of the lungs, which means you're seeing the diaphragm underneath the lungs. It's still part of the respiratory system. It still is a major breathing muscle, but you can see it a little better on this picture. On the model, in the upper abdominal cavity with a bunch of organs removed, you can see two matching kind of brown items. Those would be the kidneys. The kidneys are part of the urinary system. They do take in blood. The blood is magically filtered. Yeah, well, it is magically filtered and made into urine. The urine does drain into a couple of tubes that eventually drain to the urinary bladder. There is one tan bladder in the middle of the pelvic region there. Both the kidney and the bladder are part of the urinary system. There's an adrenal gland. Each of the two brown spots would be the kidneys. There's a little kind of orange hat that sits on top of each kidney. The orange hat would be the adrenal glands. A lot of people think the adrenal glands are part of the urinary system. They sit right on top of a kidney after all. But really they're more part of the endocrine gland. They secrete a bunch of hormones, some of which are associated with regulating blood volume, so they're kind of, sort of, maybe like the kidney. They're really not part of the urinary system. They're part of the endocrine system, but they do sit right on top of the kidney. On this picture, we do see the brain, which is in the nervous system, and you can see it's actually in its cranial cavity this time. The brain, the spinal cord, and all sorts of nerves would be part of the nervous system, sending instant messages to the body and back to the brain. Skin is in the integumentary system. That first I word thing, the one that covers the surface of the body. Skin, hair, nails, this, that, the other, are all part of the integumentary system. One of the easy things to see on our model is skin. So there you go. On page 65, there's some more instructional objectives, but we don't usually put those on the lab exam. Check with your actual lab instructor as to whether or not you need to know about the directional terms and the body planes, number 7, number 8. Well, actually number 8 we do need to know. Complete the questions at the end of the lab exercise. On page 71 there are some questions. The first one says write the name of the organ systems, singular or plural, to which each of the following organs and structures belong. I'm going to pause this for a few minutes. I'm going to pause for a few seconds. You might have to pause for a few minutes while you figure out which organ system these are in. There are a few of them that we just thought that was too much detail. Check with your instructor. They might ask you to know these, but we don't ask you to identify these on the lab exam, so we're probably not going to ask you what organ system are they in. Hopefully you didn't have too much trouble finding these. The liver is in the digestive system. The urinary bladder kind of gives itself away. It's in the urinary system. The kidney is in the urinary system. The lungs are in the respiratory system. Hair, okay, it might have taken finding it on the chart. It is in the integumentary system. The small intestine is in the digestive system. The seminal vesicle, that's actually boy parts. That's part of the reproductive system, but don't worry about studying that one. The heart is in the cardiovascular system. The trachea is better known as your windpipe. We'll talk about it in 1409 in the respiratory system. Right now it's in the OMIT system. The pancreas is in the digestive system and the endocrine system. Remember, it does secrete some digestive organs, so that does make it part of the digestive system. But it also secretes insulin and glucagon, which are hormones, so it's also part of the endocrine system. The spinal cord is in the nervous system. The ureter is the connection between the kidney to the bladder, so it would be in the urinary system, but you won't need to know that until 1409. The adrenal gland, we did say, secretes some hormones, so it's in the endocrine system. The diaphragm is usually thought of in the respiratory system, but it is a big major breathing muscle, so it's also in the muscular system. Cartilage, just omit that one. I think they put it in the skeletal system in the book. The urethra is part of the urinary system, just omit that one. The testes and ovaries would be some reproductive organs. The pituitary gland is one of the it's one of the endocrine glands, but yes, we are omitting that. At the bottom of page 71, and continued on page 72, I'd ask you to write the name of the body cavity that each of the following organs and structures is found in. What I tell my class is to use the most specific cavity. For example, the brain is found in the cranial cavity. You could have technically said the dorsal body cavity because it is on the backside, but do try to use the most specific cavity, so we would be talking about the cranial cavity. Again, I'm going to pause for a few seconds. You may need to pause the video to think about where the rest of them are. Watch out for number 7, 9, and 10 where we are omitting those. So, using the most specific cavity, the brain is in the cranial cavity. The stomach is in the abdominal cavity, which, yes, is part of the abdominal pelvic cavity, which is part of the ventral cavity, which is why I said use the most specific cavity. The bladder is in the pelvic cavity. The lungs are in the pleural cavity. The heart is in the pericardial cavity. The liver is in the abdominal cavity. The spleen we're omitting, but it is in the abdominal cavity. The spinal cord is in the spinal cavity. The fallopian tubes we're omitting. They're girl parts, they're in the pelvic cavity. The gallbladder we're omitting, it's underneath the liver and in the abdominal cavity. On page 72, number 3 is fill in the blank with the best directional term. Again, check with your lecture instructor or your lab instructor, but most of us don't actually do these, so I wasn't really providing answers. Send me an email if you're in my class. I can give you the answers. It's not a problem, but since it's not going to be on the lab exam anyway, never mind. Do be sure to study everything for the lab exam number 2, everything since lab exam number 1. So exercise 15, mitosis, exercise 20, introduction to genetics, exercise 21, human genetics, the natural selection videos, and exercise 7, organ systems. If you are planning to take Biology 1409 on the South Campus, don't sell your lab book. We pick up with exercise 8, cardiovascular system, and keep going for the rest of the 1409 semester. On the other hand, if you were not taking Biology 1409, the lab book is yours to throw away, give away, sell, whatever. But if you were just going to throw your book away, I do take donations for future students. If you could bring your book by either SSCI 1212 and hand it to the science secretary, or you can take it by SSCI 1709A I don't think you can slide it under the door, but if you'll just set it in the little window, kind of set it up, I'll get it when I get back. Thank you.